All around us, we see all kinds of needs and we see all kinds of opportunities. But oftentimes the needs that we see, we're unable to address those needs for the various reasons. But then there comes along those needs that we can address, and God convicts us about those things that we can do, and He calls upon us to do the things that He wants us to do. In our story here in the first part of Nehemiah, we find that God's people had been carried off into captivity, but not everyone. Some had been left behind because they were not really good enough to be carried off into captivity. And others had escaped from the Babylonian captivity, had just simply returned home. Nehemiah, who was the cupbearer of the king, the person who tested all his drinks and food, and also who gave him advice, was living a comfortable life as he was a resident of the king's palace, and could have left things as they were and could have lived a good life. And yet he becomes convicted about the plight of his people back in Jerusalem, which changes his whole outlook on what was important in his life. And eventually he will leave the comfort of the palace and end up going back to Jerusalem to build the wall and to build the gates. He began his journey, though, by first seeing that there was a need that needed to be fulfilled. Certain brethren had come from Judah, which is where Jerusalem is located, and he made the mistake of asking them. He said, well, how are things with the captives who are there in Jerusalem? How are things with them? And they gave him a report, and they said, well, they're in a bad way. They're in affliction and reproach because the wall is broken down and the gates have been burned. And in the fourth verse of that first chapter, we find that Nehemiah was so moved by the plight of the people of his own people, it says that he began to weep, to cry, if you will. And this is what changed his attitude toward what was going on. Today, as we look around our church, we still see a lot of needs that should be carried out. And I wonder sometimes, does the plight of the lost and the unchurched in our community cause us to weep, causes us to cry? Are we convicted about the people that God would have us reach only if we were in tune with His will? If we want to do His will, the people we could reach, does it break our heart to see that there are those who wander around lost, unchurched, with no direction in their life? He gives to us, though, not only the feeling of need, but He gives to us the opportunity to do something about it. We find that in our story that Nehemiah was serving the king, a prestigious position for someone who is no more than a captive in the land. He'd worked himself to that position, and we find that as he was doing that in that second chapter, that his countenance became sad. He's become burdened for his people, and the king noticed something wrong with him. He said, Nehemiah, is there something wrong with you? Is there something that you need? Is something I can do for you? We find that was Nehemiah's opportunity to speak up and to do something to advance the cause of his people back in Jerusalem. And he says, well, how can I be happy and how can I be joyful when my people are suffering back in Jerusalem? Some 15 years ago, maybe 16 years ago, this church became aware of a need in our community, but also more than just aware of that need, became convicted and became aware of the opportunity that we had. You see, our town was growing. Our building had become much too small. And actually, a few years before that 15 years ago, our youth and our children's departments had grown to such a point that there was no more space for them to meet in our church. And what church growth specialists will tell you, that when you have filled the room, you can put no more in the room. No, you don't maintain that attendance. You actually begin to decrease in your attendance. And that happened to us. We had maxed out in our youth and children's programs, and the numbers had begun to decline. Something had to be done. And so with that burden in mind and with the opportunity to do something, the church got together and decided that they would do something. Now, what was the strength of the church at that time? At that time, the church was in pretty good unity. Things were going well. People were happy. They were happy with the people who worked here. But also something else, as we surveyed the congregation, We had a lot of empty nesters in our church. We had a lot of people who gave a lot of money to our church, and we realized how financially strong we were. This was the time to move, to do something. We didn't know how much longer the church would be in this condition. And so we began to meet, began to talk about the potential and the possibility. What kind of building did we need? What kind of building should be built on these premises? What should be done? And so we're having to decide that. We began the preparation. We find in our story of Nehemiah, as he was preparing to go back to Jerusalem, he prepared the way by first going to the king and saying, King, I need letters to get me past these various kingdoms I'm going to come in contact with to allow me to pass safely and to go to Jerusalem. And the king wrote him letters. He said, I need another letter. I need a letter written to the keeper of the king's forest to give us the timber we need to build the gates of the wall of the city of Jerusalem. And the king gave him that. We find that when he got to Jerusalem at night, he left everyone else, and he and just a few people went their way and began to survey the damage to the wall. What needs to be done to rebuild this wall? Lastly, we find that 17th and 18th verse of 2nd Nehemiah. He begins to motivate the people there. This is what needs to be done. Here's what you're going to encounter. We need to get up and we need to get this thing done. All as we prepared to build our building 15 years ago, a lot had to be done. We had to put together committees of people to work. It was too much for one person. We needed a building committee. Someone had to go out and select an architect, and so we put together a building committee. We also had to have a financial committee. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to raise the money? And so we put together that committee. Also, as we got into the raising of money, we had to get another group of people to put together packets to go to individual homes to promote the need of the building. We also had a group of people to work with the video that you just saw. A lot to be done to build that building. In preparation, before we even broke ground, a lot of money had to be raised. A lot of interest had to be generated. And then we find in that third chapter of Nehemiah, there was the organization to do the work. I remember several years ago as we were getting ready to do this, I preached a series of sermons, and I enjoyed the third chapter because in the third chapter what you find is a series of names of people and groups of people who volunteered to build not the whole wall, but just a section of the wall. They stood shoulder to shoulder to build their section of that wall, and as some built because there was hostility to the building of that wall, others stood guard with their swords to make sure no one came and disturbed the work that was being done on the wall. That's how things get done. Shoulder to shoulder. Just do my part. I don't have to build the whole wall. I don't have to build every gate. Just a section of the wall. Just one gate is all I have to do. They stood shoulder to shoulder and began the work. As I thought about our church today, some 13 and a half years later, I thought, are there needs in our community? Are there opportunities to meet those needs in our community? And then I got to think, the opportunity and the needs are still the same. There are still lots of people who are unchurched, and we're still a strong church. We're still a good church. There are things that need to be done. And I began to think about what needs to be done. And I got some good news for you. Everything I thought that needed to be done in our church did not take money. Everything I thought that needed to be done in our church could be done by the congregation. We didn't need to raise money. We just had to raise the spirit and the interest of the people to get those things done. That's all we had to do. I believe that in our congregation, the first thing that we can do as a church is we need to become very open and a very welcoming group of people to the others who would come to our church. We think that we're open and we think that we welcome people into our congregation, but I don't think that that's always true. It's not that we mean to be snobbish, but sometimes we back up from what needs to be done. Every member of our church is responsible for making new people feel welcome into our church. And we do that by opening up our circle of friends. We all enjoy being with certain people. If you don't let yourself, not aware of it, you become very content just to be with that group of people. There are a lot of people in our church, in our community, that are very interesting people. People who would come to our church if our church is open to their coming to our church. We've got to leave our comfort zone as a group of people and open up. We have visitors here this morning. We have good visitors here this morning. People who would be a good part of our church, but will they feel welcome in our church? Are we willing to invite them out to pizza or to our home? Are we willing to speak to them every time they show up? Are we open to new people in our church? For our church to grow, we've got to be open and very welcoming. Are we that church yet? It doesn't cost money to do that. It just costs us to get out of our comfort zone and to move forward. The need to care enough for people and to have enough confidence in our church that we are willing to invite others to come to our church. That's the other thing. Most people who will visit our church will not just wander in on their own. They won't come by and see a sign and think that they should drop in, although some do. Most will visit our church because some church member cared enough about them and believed enough in our church to believe they'd be comfortable in our church to invite them to come to our church. Again, that causes us to get out of our comfort zone. I've not invited anybody ever to come to our church. I'm not sure they feel welcome there. You've got to believe that when people come to our church, they will feel welcome here. And that they need our church because they need the Lord. We need that kind of confidence. We need to be willing and able to do that. And then, lastly, a need for a mission spirit, a spirit of outreach. The greatest churches in our convention are the churches who place a high emphasis on missions, who are not content to maintain the status quo inside the walls, but who reach out beyond the walls. Now, all these things I just mentioned to you were driven home to me just a few months ago. A friend of mine who grew up in this church, went to school in Coweta, who's a minister in another city, a very successful minister, came by my office, and he wanted to talk about his church. He had started church from scratch, and they had reached the number 300. They were running 300 in church, and he said, you know what? We got there pretty fast. It just took a few years to get there. We were very aggressive. The community was very open to our church. And we got there. He said, something happened when we got there. He said, our numbers have plateaued. They have become stagnant. He said, we can't get people to come or motivated to join our church. And he said, it's hard for me to know what's happened. It's hard to know what to do about what's happened. And as I listened to him, it reminded me of something I have often thought about churches. Churches grow and they get to the point where they're strong and they're healthy.